we're going to talk about activity-based costing, or ABC costing. Allocating costs. Again, we're talking about cost allocation. Taking one cost and spreading it to whatever. To a job, to an activity, to a process. And what are we allocating anyway? We're allocating costs that we have assigned to direct labor and direct materials. So if we are going to be building or assembling a bicycle, for example, we want to make certain that all of the costs, or all of the costs that are relates to the materials, which is the wheels, the spokes, and the handlebars, and all of that, and that's work in process. Then we take the next step, would be the labor portion, would be the assembly of that particular bicycle, and then painting it and all of that, and then moving it to finished goods, and then dealing with the costs that have nothing directly associated with that cost, which is going to be our overhead, and then allocating that cost to the various portions of that process. So in ABC costing, for example, we are going to be looking at costs, indirect costs, for example. We're going to be looking at costs that cannot be directly traced to that bicycle being assembled. We are not going to be manufacturing the wheels, the tires, and all of that. We're going to be buying tires. That's part of our materials. We're going to be buying the parts that they need, the handlebars, for example. We're not going to be actually putting together an actual chain that goes on the actual bicycle. We'll buy that, but we will be taking those on different items and putting them together to create this bicycle. So when there are costs associated with the job or with the process, we need to be able to know what kinds of costs that really are not directly associated with the manufacturing or the assembly of a bicycle. And again, it's the same old thing over and over again. This is nothing new. Anything that's not directly associated with that particular, that bicycle in this example, supervision, tools, necessarily in assembly, but not necessarily in the bike itself. And that can be tricky. So I have to be honest with you. Be very careful there. There are other different types of costs that are not necessarily traced. But again, if you're using, and you can use, again, a screwdriver. Screwdriver is not a part of that bike. And so that's going to be indirect material. Do you get what I'm trying to say here? I mean, so if we think this thing through, we know for a fact a bicycle has handlebars, bicycle has wheels, bicycle has pedals. That's part of a bike. But when we put that bike together, we're going to be using tools like a screwdriver. Screwdriver is not a part of the bicycle. So how do we account for the cost of that screwdriver that we use to assemble that bicycle? Oh, we're going to assume it's going to be a part of the overhead. There you go. Now we've got it. So when we think about things like that, it becomes actually common sense. It actually makes, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So read through the chapter and understand when we were talking about process costing in our previous discussion. Hopefully you got that first. What constitutes a process costing project, and what constitutes a job costing, which is appropriate to have that, and then using ABC costing to allocate costs. Again, all we care about really is that overhead. That overhead is going to be always looming. How do we allocate costs? We can use ABC costing to do it. We can use a predetermined rate. How do we do it? Why do we do it? Under which circumstances is it appropriate? And again, using predetermined overhead rates, again, organizations know how to build their bicycles. They know the type of things that are involved in that process. So using a predetermined overhead rate, it may not be off the mark, to be honest with you. It might be quite important and actually very, very useful. But again, when you're using a predetermined rate every year, I would say most organizations always take a look back. A look back means to go back and see, how did it work last year? How close were we? Did we have too high or under allocated? Did we have too high over allocated? That's an important question to ask, because when you're using a predetermined rate and you're over allocated or you're way under allocating, one would suspect you need to think about using a different rate or different measure to allocate your costs. So, ABC costing. And what I would like to say with ABC costing is just another way to to combine and allocate overhead costs. So we're going to have to establish pools, cost pools. And again, there's another term here. So when you're reading through this chapter, this is one chapter I would say highlight, if you can, highlight the different terms that are, that you have not used before or not familiar with you. Cost pool is one. Highlight that. Understand what a cost pool, what composition of a cost pool in the context of this ABC costing. So here you determine your cost pools. And then what is going to be the driver? In this case, activity rate. What's going to be the rate? Is it going to be at labor hours? Is it going to be, again, what's going to be the driver? What's going to be the driver that gives us a predetermined rate for each cost pool? And why are we doing this? Because we want to be able to measure our overhead and how we allocate it to a particular job or process in such a way that we get a reasonable allocation, a very highly accurate allocation of our overhead. That's why we're doing it. So it's the how we're doing it, it's the why we're doing it. And then again, as I mentioned before, using a predetermined rate does work very, very well, and organizations almost always take a look back and evaluate that predetermined rate. And if we have over-allocated significantly, one would suspect we need to rethink how we're allocating overhead. But if we're under-allocating, grossly under-allocating on a material basis, we need to reconsider. So we're not looking to hit it right on the button, but we certainly want to come close. And every time, so we always look back. But using a predetermined rate to determine how we're allocating overhead costs, because it's not really hard to allocate the cost. It's not really hard to determine the materials that are associated with this particular job or process. It's not real hard to determine what's indirect and direct labor. That's pretty straightforward. The overhead is what gets cloudy. And this is a way to remove some of the ambiguity and make it a little bit more clear and more systematic in our approach and how we allocate those costs, because they're not necessarily direct. In fact, they're very much indirect in how we allocate those costs. Because when you think about it, the cost that we have for our entire product, whether it be via a job, whether it be a process, it's going to really drive our profit margin. So it becomes significant to allocate appropriately. It becomes important to be able to use measures that are reasonably accurate and can be relied upon so that decisions can be made. We are not profitable making this bicycle. Should we outsource? Should we cut manufacturing to half production in a year? Questions like that simply cannot be answered by a statement of financial position. It cannot be answered by a balance sheet. Cannot be answered through a cash flow statement. These questions have to be answered in context of cost allocation using whether the ABC approach or another approach, but it has to be answered in that way. So it becomes quite important for managers when they're making decisions on increasing the production of this, or manufacturing, or the assembly of these bicycles, or decrease, or using outsourcing. Again, all of these are about management decisions. You're never able to achieve these answers by looking at the face of the financial statements on their own. There's simply not enough data to do that. So don't lose heart as to why you're doing this and what's all of this and how does it make sense in the real world. It makes sense because the financial statements simply, in many ways, cannot provide the kind of specific data that's needed for internal managers to make a decision. And this gives you good tools to do that. So it is not a wasted effort. It is an important process, and it is most certainly relevant today. So I'm going to get down to it. So as you're reading through the chat, so I don't particularly like using this particular method to go through screens by screen. I want you to read the chapter, and my job here is to highlight things I think you need to really focus your attention on as you are reading. So don't think that I'm going to be reading every line on here, because I'm not. But I will say that if you understand what you're trying to accomplish when you're job costing, when you're allocating costs, and when you're looking at numbers and trying to interpret its meaning, reading this, it becomes important to know that allocating overhead becomes the absolute vital piece of that. Because as you know, it's easy to determine what your materials are. It's easy to determine your labor. People who are physically working on the product, they're direct labor. An actual item that's going to be a part of that bicycle, that's the direct material. Anything else is other, indirect. And that's the big bucket, that's the big area, that's really that unknown factor, that variable factor that we really have to kind of control. And you'll find that most organizations, when they start cutting costs, where do they cut first? Rarely, and I'm talking rarely, do they go out to the direct materials. Rarely do they go out to the direct labor. They're going to always jump at the overhead, because that's the area where you really need to be careful. And in a lot of places, the overhead is the key to either a product being discontinued because it's too expensive, or a product being unprofitable because the cost allocation is inappropriate and wrong. So if you look at things like that, hopefully this chapter won't be so overwhelming to understand and to grasp. So what you're looking at now is just reviewing the formula. I don't like looking at formulas too much, because I think if you understand the concepts, the formulas come naturally. Because accounting has systematically been very, very logical, and I continue to see its logic. So I want you to first put most of your attention on the conceptual understanding of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how it's relevant, and why it's relevant. And then think about how the formulas factor into that through your practice and through looking at just going through practicing with your homework. So understanding the formula, that's really the computation side of it. The conceptual side is more important. If you don't understand the concepts, it makes no sense to do it right in mathematics, because you can't explain what you've done. You can't make use of what you've done. You can't apprehend or communicate what you've done. You have to get the concepts and what we're trying to grasp here, and why it's relevant, and how it's different from a process that's similar but different. Similar in terms of costing, but different in terms of method and in terms of what we are going to be doing in terms of a job or a process. So when we think about what's best and what's not best, I would say the most important thing is the better estimate is one that reflects the most information that can be used. That's the best estimate. And if you can use this information and it reflects absolutely what's going on, that's the better estimate. Why? Because your decision is going to be based on that. So as you're finishing this chapter, think about really the conceptual aspect of costing, why we do all this work, and what does it mean in particular, and what kind of consequences are the result of a bad decision based on poor analysis, poor costing methods, and over allocation, and not really understanding the nature of overhead and how it could truly impact profitability of an organization. So think about those things, and then work and through practice and your homework on the computations. And as always, thank you so much for your time and energy for listening to this video. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.